Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for Speaking the Truth to Power through Pedagogy, Anti-Racist Teaching in Higher Education, the third in the We Are Not Okay, Injustice, Action, and Healing series. Before we get started, I would like to provide some logistical information. We ask that you please bear with us during this presentation, as some panelists may be having technical difficulties due to the weather. Everyone will be working to stay connected and will reconnect as able throughout the session. Please note that if you are viewing this session on a laptop or computer, you will have viewing options in the upper right corner of your screen. You will be able to select between viewing the active speaker on the full screen, viewing the active speaker and thumbnail views of the rest of the panel, or selecting a grid view to see all speakers on one screen throughout the meeting. If you will be viewing our sign language interpreters, we recommend using the grid view. During this meeting, you will only be able to view and hear our panelists. However, we will be holding a question and answer session. To ask a question, you may select the button at the bottom of your screen that shows a square with a question mark in it. From there, you will be able to send your questions in a chat box. Questions will begin being answered once the question and answer portion begins. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible given the time we have set aside for this meeting. If your question is not answered, please email us at dei@rowan.edu. At this time, I am happy to introduce the Senior Director of Student Success and Inclusion Programs at Rowan University, Dr. Dawn Singleton.
Good afternoon. My name is Dawn Singleton, and on behalf of the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, I would like to welcome you to Session 3 of our series, We Are Not Okay, Injustice, Action, and Healing. We are so excited that you have joined us for this critical discussion today. I would like to start by introducing first our moderator, Dr. Kristen Barrett, and also Rowan University Provost, Dr. Tony Lohman, who will provide opening remarks. Here's a few highlights from Dr. Lohman's bio. Tony Lohman began his current role as the Provost and Senior Vice President of Academic Affairs at Rowan University on July 1st of 2019. Dr. Lohman previously served as the Dean of the Henry M. Rowan College of Engineering since 2013. During his career, Tony has held academic and leadership appointments at both Temple University and Drexel University. He received his education in chemical engineering at the University of Virginia in 1993, and at Purdue, he received his PhD in 1997. Dr. Lohman?
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Singleton. It is certainly a pleasure to be here today talking to this panel. I can say this, and I've spoken many times in my academic career, probably thousands of classes and seminars and lectures, but I must say, going into this panel, this might be the most thrilled I am and excited to join and hear something, but also the most terrified, because it's something that maybe myself, this is truly taking me outside of my comfort zone, which I think is where we all need to be at these times. As an educator myself, I always try to do the right thing in my classes, in the laboratories where I worked and where I taught students. And for a long time, as I moved through my progression, I thought, that's enough if I'm doing the right thing. As I grew into my role in academic administration as a dean, I learned that there's more I could do. There's more we could do to reach underrepresented groups. There's more we can do to listen and learn. And today, as I'm sitting here today as provost, I realize we haven't done nearly enough. So I'm excited to be here today because I think we have a fantastic panel put together of a very diverse group of representing our faculty across campus. I think we're moving through just exceptional times for a number of reasons. And I think now is the time we should take advantage for change. So I'm looking forward to listening to this group of panelists. I'm looking forward to listening to the questions and the dialogue we get today on how each of these individuals has included anti-racist topics into their classes and really teach to our entire population, not just one set of privileged students. So I'm excited to be here and listen, but I'm even more excited to take the next step after we get it out of here. That is, not just have this sprinkled throughout classes by passionate faculty members who take the initiative to do the right thing in the class, but how do we make this part of our DNA as we are as an educational institution? How do we create classes and an educational system, a campus environment that is fair and just to everybody. So I really am thankful for the opportunity to come here today and open the panel. And I'm even more thankful for the opportunity to listen to the dialogue today and then have the opportunity to work with our campus community to implement this going forward. So thanks for that. I'm going to sit back and just be an observer for this group.
Thank you, Dr. Lohman, for your remarks. And I would like to take this time to welcome our audience to today's event. I would also like to acknowledge our university president, Dr. Hoshman, as well as our Board of Trustees members who are in attendance, Tom Gallia and Chad Bruner. I would like to remind our audience that at the beginning and throughout this session, we ask that everyone take a moment to go to their social media and use our hashtag to share your comments. Hashtag RU, the letters RU, we are not okay. You can learn more about Rowan's Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion by going to our website, rowan.edu//DEI. Our session today, Speaking Truth to Power Through Pedagogy, Anti-Racist Teaching in Higher Education. This session will build upon faculty members' awareness of systemic racism while exploring anti-racist pedagogy and its application across all disciplines. I'll now take this time to introduce our first panelist. We have Josh Stoltz. Josh graduated from Indiana University in 2015 with a BS degree in biology. He received his master's from Rowan University in bioinformatics. While he was a student at Rowan, he was very active and aware. And in his current work, which is at the intersection of genomics, data science, and software engineering, he realizes that there is a lack of African Americans. And so his goal in his lab is to try to make strides in ensuring that there are presence of ethnic minorities in genomic medicine. So now we'd like to introduce Josh and ask you why or how does this topic of anti-racist pedagogy relate to you?
Sure. It's this has kind of been more of a personal thing than a career thing. I grew up, so I went to Woodstown Middle School. I lived there, and certainly at that time, the way things were, there was a lot of overt racism. There wasn't two ways about it. And that still feels kind of prickly to say in front of a room full of people because I love all my family and I love everyone there, but it was ugly. And then I moved to Indiana, and that was like just whitewashed. Like, like one black kid in the school kind of thing. But I played sports, and so the few black kids on my team, it was very visible to me that they were not treated equally. And that started challenging some of the beliefs I had. They were like, these people I care about are being mistreated, and it's not fair. And then certainly when I went to college, my best friend's parents passed away from schizophrenia. And that really just galvanized me because they were African American, and it was something that could have been seen from 5 years out. And it was so hard to get anyone to do anything. And I really felt that people just didn't care. And so that was really when I just started reading books, trying to learn, trying to get involved. And yeah, obviously America hasn't stopped being America since then, and these issues haven't stopped, but that's where this story started for me, and to try to make myself, because in those situations at the time, I was useless. I was just another guy that was a doofus and had no idea what was going on, and so I tried to make myself more helpful to the people around me.
Thank you, Josh, and we appreciate your personal experience. Our next panelist, Dr. Chanel Rose, is currently having technical difficulties. She specializes in African American history. So for now, we're going to move on to our next panelist, Dr. Kenzo Sun. Dr. Kenzo Sun is an assistant professor of urban education and foundations. Dr. Sun research areas include urban education, policy, ethnic studies, history of education, political and economy, critical race theory, and 20th century social movements and reform. His current research analyzes how the interplay of social movements, forces, and policies shaped urban schooling and communities since the 1960s U.S. war on poverty. Drawing from these cases of bilingual education, Head Start, racial desegregation, and school to work programs. So with that, we'd like to ask Dr. Kenzo the same question. Can you address, from your viewpoint, why this topic of anti-racist pedagogy is important?
Good afternoon, and thank you to Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for hosting this session. Just real quick, I'm excited to be here with my fellow panelists and thank the audience for joining us. I'd like to start by recognizing that this series is in response to the mass protests and uprising ignited by the murder of George Floyd. And to reiterate what Dr. Shelley Zion stated last week during the first session, while his death was horrifying, it should not be at all surprising, as this is just the latest in 400 plus years of racial oppression and domination in the US that continues to center on anti-Blackness in the afterlife of slavery. And I think it's also equally important in this the fact that there is also a 400 plus year legacy of anti-racist resistance, which the current Black Lives Matter movement draws from, and that has often centered on Black communities, but also includes coalition building with other communities racialized as non-white, and even those racialized as white. And one key part in this resistance work has been educating through what we could now call anti-racist teaching. So just to be clear on some terms, racism for me in its simplest explanation is a structured system of power that functions to privilege and oppress based on the idea of race and racial difference. And as such, anti-racist teaching at its core aims to highlight, resist, and disrupt racism's structured set of power relations, rather than focusing on the interpersonal or cultural differences as the main issue. So, and beyond specific curriculum content or activities, which we could get into more later, I'd like to briefly focus on what I have found to be, in my own teaching, to be two foundational elements of anti-racist pedagogy. So the first being purpose and the second being praxis. So first, in terms of purpose, at its core, the purpose of anti-racist teaching is to dismantle and end racism and white supremacy, period. Right. So, and I will share a short story about when I started graduate school to clarify this point. So on the first day of orientation, I went to introduce myself to my doctoral advisor. And I said, hi, he said, yeah, nice to meet you. I actually have a question for you. I remember your file, both the high school you graduated from and the middle school you taught at were failing schools, right? And I was like, and he replied, let me rephrase. In both schools, over 50% of the students of color never graduated from high school. By any definition of the word, these are failing schools, right? Or are you going to argue otherwise? And I said, yep, I agree, they are failing. And he said, okay, glad we got that cleared up. Now my question is for those two schools, reform them or blow them up? And he said, and I was like, hi, my name is Kenzo. I just arrived here 10 minutes ago. And he was like, no, I need an answer from you now. Reform them or blow them up? And I said, if I had to pick, I would say blow them up. And he said, good, I think I could work with you. Now remind me again why you just spent the last 5 years teaching and why you're now joining an Ed Policy PhD program. But before I could say anything, he said, you know what, don't answer that. I have office hours next Tuesday. You can meet with me next week with your answer. We could talk about it from there. And what I didn't know at the time was that our conversation would go on for at least the next 4 years and forced me to be clear about what institutional racism was and what it would take to make meaningful change. And at its core, the question focused on if I believed that schools were mostly successful, but had minor problems with failing their Black and brown students in particular, and thus just needed some adjustment or reform. Or if schools were fundamentally succeeding at doing exactly what they meant to do and miseducating non-white students to reproduce a racist system. And thus the only real way to create real change was to start anew. And to clarify, it doesn't have to be a simple binary either. As the Black Panther Party argued for survival when pending revolution, what we could do in doing the intermediate goals of helping to survive in a racist society, we cannot lose sight of the fundamental goal of transforming society as a whole. Anything less is not anti-racist teaching to me. And then the second point in terms of praxis. So like often learning to do anything. So riding a bicycle, learning to play basketball or guitar, even learning to teach. Beyond just reading and learning anti-racist teaching involves the hard work of actual practice. However, it's not just practice and repetition by itself, but rather what is often referred to in critical educational theory as the term praxis, as being both action and reflection. So constantly trying to both apply yourself in your understanding and then learn from what you actually tried and actively did. and not just individually in your own classrooms, but how to both act and reflect collectively, as this is central to movement building and creating meaningful social change. This is a key point for anti-racist educators in maintaining a critical perspective as the world continues to change, and racism does too. So with one key example being the idea of colorblindness, which was largely understood to be a progressive ideal during the early civil rights movement, including MLK's famous 1963 I Have a Dream speech, yet now has been co-opted by the right through the use of the idea of colorblind racism to shut down discussions about race by saying anybody who notices or talks about race is racist. So, but I think it's best that I stop here. I'm guessing we could get more into the Q&A session, more into things during the Q&A session. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sung, for your comments and your perspective and your definitions too. I think it's nice to set a foundation as to what we mean when we say anti-racist pedagogy and just having those definitions out there. Our next panelist is Rachel Shapiro. Dr. Shapiro's research, she's been at Rowan for 15 years, I'll add, and her research and teaching focuses on social justice, linguistic diversity, anti-racist, and decolonial pedagogy. And like I said, she's been doing this for 15 years. Currently, she is in the writing arts department here at Rowan. She also has service to K-5 teachers in her literacy studies program. She has been known to be an advocate for linguistic justice, multilingual, and non-standard language user. So we'd like to welcome Dr. Shapiro, and we'll ask her the same question. Dr. Shapiro, if you can give us a little bit about why you're here and how this topic relates to or interests you.
Hi, thank you so much. I just want to start by saying thanks to the DEI office for organizing this important series. Thank you to all of the attendees for being a part of it, and I'm, of course, honored to be here. We were asked to speak to how we got here to this moment sort of collectively, and I think this is such a big question that the first panel in our webinar series really spoke to so well. I think for higher education, there's actually no more important question than how we got to this moment. It's imperative that we take a long and deep look at ourselves and see how we've helped to maintain racism and white supremacy in our institutions. The clearest answer that I've been able to come to as I've been thinking about this week is that in higher education, we have historically built our programs, our courses, and our curricula to serve an imagined default white student body. The continuing use of standardized test scores for entry into our programs, despite the large body of research that reveals racial bias in the tests, is all the evidence we need. But if we need more, we can look at the achievement gap between white students and students of color across the nation and at Rowan specifically. If our students are struggling in our courses and on our campus, then we have not built the spaces needed to facilitate their success. To be colorblind in our teaching, as Kenzo mentioned, means that we are not explicitly taking into consideration the particular needs, goals, and talents of our students of color. And in the words of our Student Government Association President Ariel Gideon from last week's session, in 2020, we've done had enough. Anti-racist teaching can help us do right by Ms. Gideon and all of our students of color as we work to consciously and intentionally fight white supremacy and work for justice and freedom as allies to our students of color. This is particularly true for white educators like myself. In disability studies, scholars and activists have critiqued the tendency to design spaces, events, and media for able-bodied users, attending to the needs of users with disabilities only after the fact by retrofitting our spaces. They have helped us see that the spaces we build should be born accessible, rather than ignoring and dismissing access concerns until there's a problem or a lawsuit. So like disability, race and racism need to be a part of our curricular design from the beginning. We need to design born anti-racist programs and courses. As we face the uncertainty of the fall and all the semesters that follow, it's time to start asking ourselves, how can we conceive new models of remote, high-flex, and face-to-face teaching that include Black, Indigenous, and people of color's ways of knowing and being from the starting point? Rather than simply revising old syllabi by adding an author of color to the reading list, for instance, how can we design courses that invite students of color to co-create learning goals, assignment design, and assessment approaches? How can we be transparent about our anti-racist values and accountable to those values by putting them in our putting them in writing in our department mission statements, our learning outcomes, our syllabi, our assignment sheets? How can we adopt anti-racist assessment techniques like grading contracts to help close the achievement gap? I'm really excited to be here, and I really want to hear those tactics and strategies that you've been using and how we can come together collectively to continue building a born anti-racist learning culture. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Shapiro, for your comments. And as an educator, we're all educators here, but as an educator myself, I realize how important it is this should be a grassroots, to really bring it in from the beginning. Like you said, not something we sprinkle in as a secondary idea. So I appreciate that. I'd like to take this moment just to remind our audience that you can use your social media to share your comments with the hashtag RU, the letters, and then we are not okay. Remember, you can do that on your social media. And then at this time, you can start to submit questions. Allison explains how you could use WebEx to submit questions to our panelists, so you can begin to do that. So while our questions are filtering in, I'll just start with one. I'm going to ask Josh this question. In addition to anti-racist teaching, what student experiences, do you feel are important for students actively working to be anti-racist?
Yeah, so I always look back at the guys I grew up with who had the same ideology as me. Why did I go left and they went right? I think information is great, but you have to understand racism is diagnosed as a mental illness. It isn't just an ignorance like you're bad at math or you don't know algebra. And I think that's rooted in empathy, and it's rooted in humility. A lot of white people are conditioned to have a feeling of superiority over people around them, and so then it's hard to listen and ever get information. And on top of that, there's an empathy issue. We see these things on the news every day, but we're told these people aren't us, they'll never be us. And so we see the pain, but we don't feel it ourselves. And I think what helped me was both having close and accountable friendships with people I cared about who were people of color. I traveled a lot. And when I traveled, it wasn't some savior mindset, like I'm gonna go fix. I was just really genuinely curious about how does the rest of the world live and how can I get to know these people? And then as well, you have to humble yourself. Like at some point, you just have to tell the truth and say you're ignorant and you have prejudice. And that the people of color in the room are of value to you. Because I had hoped, I left this out, but I lived up in New England. And my idea for a long time was that if I just move to where there's a lot of liberals, I'll get away from the racism. But they have all of the information but none of the humility, none of the empathy. And so they're Barack Obama voters, this and that. But Connecticut was the most segregated and hostile place I've ever lived in my life, even though they're like 99% very, very liberal. And it's because they still are conditioned to think they're like better than people, and they don't recognize that. So yeah, I would say in the humility and the empathy have to go in line with the information and education for it to be effective.
Thank you, Josh. And I totally agree that having knowledge is not in itself is not effective, right? We have to have other values and morals within ourselves to move that knowledge forward. Dr. Chanel Rose is on, our other panelist is on the line. We cannot see her video, but she is here by audio. So again, just to introduce Dr. Rose, she has authored 2 books in the field of African American history. The first is called The Struggle for Black Freedom in Miami, Civil Rights in America's Tourist Paradise. And it examines the long struggle for civil rights in one of the country's most popular tourist destinations. And she also has a current book that she's working on that explores the evolution of modern Black conservatism in local communities and its impact on the African American struggle for racial equality from 1950 to 1985. She also serves as coordinator of the Africana Studies here at Rowan. So Dr. Rose, I'd like to open up our topic to you to ask you, what is it that brings you to this discussion of anti-racist pedagogy?
Thank you so much for having me. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Yeah, so I mean, I think that when I thought about, this panel and this session, I was thinking that during the election of President Barack Obama, I remember emphasizing to my students why, the courses that I teach are so important and relevant. And I would even say, I think I didn't even have to say it as much because of not just his election, but also with the Black Lives Matter movement. I just began to see this kind of consciousness in students of all backgrounds in my courses in a way that I hadn't necessarily seen before. And then when I, reflect and think about what's happening today, and with the killing of George Floyd and how I teach my courses, one of the things that I want to emphasize, I guess, is just to reflect on what I do in my courses and how I try to, or some of the objectives in regard to pushing a more kind of anti-racist pedagogy, and also thinking about some of the approaches that I think have been helpful with students. And I'll just kind of be brief because some of you have already talked about this. But I would say that for me, more than ever at this time, in this moment, the objective of teaching racial literacy in my classes, I view as really important. This is a concept I'm sure some of you may have discussed this before, but initially, sociologist Franz Twine kind of employed this term, which was supposed to initially apply to white mothers of biracial children in the UK. It was about teaching them racial awareness and a positive Black identity, but it's now become a more popular term that's used within the US context to understand the role that race plays in all aspects of society. And so for me, I teach African American history, I teach the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, Introduction to Africana Studies. And so in all of those courses, I try to give students a way to develop a language in which to discuss race, racism, anti-racism, right? A lot of these concepts that we're talking about now. And one of the ways in which I think I'm able to do that, and I think Josh may have touched on this, or Kenzo, is to kind of deconstruct this idea of race being, us living in a post-racial society, but also I think my courses force them to see race, right? I think for depending on the political background or spectrum that we fall on, there are others, some who say, we don't necessarily see race and see that as something that's somewhat anti-racist, even though I think a lot of the scholarship shows and a lot of the things that we've been talking about, that for students to see race is really important, and to see it in all of its different ways that it functions. And so structural racism, right, structural inequality, a concept that I know some of you've touched on, even though I didn't hear the beginning of the session, that this is something that I really try to convey to my students, not just personal, I think everyone has personal prejudice, and you can have overt forms of racism that we're more familiar with, but how does it work structurally? And I think in a previous session or panel, someone had mentioned Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, and I would say one of the reasons I think that this work has become such a standard text for many courses and has such a profound effect on students is because she's able to unpack and expose kind of the intricate web and system of mass incarceration in such a powerful way that was invisible, right, to most people. And so when I'm teaching courses on, civil rights and Black Power, or from Black Power to Ferguson, we address some of these more overt forms, whether that's Klan violence or lynching, or some of the markers of racism that we're more familiar with colored only signs and white only signs. But these more invisible, hidden ways in which racism works are harder for students to unpack. So I think, you know, in her work, when we use it in one of my courses, we talk about the ways in which the system works. And she kind of uses this cage metaphor where it looks at, you know, a wide variety of laws and institutions and practices. You know, I mean, I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but from racial profiling to police targeting poor communities of color to biased, you know, sentencing policies, the list goes on and on. So teaching race literacy, exposing students through a variety of different texts to what structural racism looks like, having them kind of rethink the ways in which that works, and also seeing how that relates to today, right? That it's not just something in the past. As a historian that they're studying, but I try to find ways for students to recognize why this is relevant to their experience today. And so I use different approaches to address that relevancy, but also to get them directly engaged in what we're now calling kind of anti-racist works. And I'll just give one example where I have students do student action projects where they actually have to choose a project, whether it's a campus workshop or developing a pamphlet or a survey, or I think I had in one course they had to model the Black Panthers 10-point program and apply that to a contemporary issue confronting African Americans. That it forces students to think about how the material that we've been covering over the course of the semester, how can they now apply that directly to what is happening today? And so I think that with everything that's going on now, this will be even more relevant for and important for students to see how we see happening in society today, that we're not just learning about this through this kind of lived experiences of people, but also when we're thinking about the classroom setting, how do we in some way use that to think about our own experiences and think about how we can become, even if I'm just using a project as one example, but how can they then take that, right, and think about how to apply that in other areas of their lives, which I think in some ways is kind of fostering this race consciousness that may or may have not been there before. So those are just some of the things that I've been thinking about and that I do as a way to reinforce some of these ideas about anti-racist pedagogy.
Thank you, Dr. Rose, for your comments. And I completely agree that it's important that we expose our students and help them to see that systemic and institutional racism exists in many different forms, and exposing them to that, because until they are aware that there's a problem, we can't move forward. So I appreciate your comments. So we're going to start to take some comments from some questions from the audience. And I'm going to just present this question to all of our panelists. And so any one of our panelists can feel free to respond to this question. What does an anti-racist course look like across departments and/or curriculums? Does it always look like building certain quote unquote content into a curriculum? So if any one of our panelists has a response to that question.
I mean, I can respond, but I just finished, so I don't want to continue. If anyone else.
Go ahead, Dr. Rose.
Yeah, well, I would say I think, you know, just kind of piggybacking on what I just said, I think content is really important. Using text is really important, using a variety of primary sources. But I also try to find other ways to engage the students. So I just gave an example, right, of the student action project, which forces students to work together, to think about ways to tackle a contemporary issue or movement. They are, and I give them different opportunities. They can do campus workshops, they can do pamphlets, they can do surveys. I remember a couple of semesters ago, students decided, and I can't remember the name of this particular practice, but they put together a workshop. They invited their friends, they invited me, and it was one of those exercises where they asked people, you know, a bunch of different questions. You know, have you ever been stopped by the police? Did you finish? Did your parents finish college? Like just different questions, and then people had to step forward or step backward depending on their response to the question. I'm sure this sounds familiar to my SJCR people and others, but you kind of were able to see, this is the first time, so I'm learning from students, right, which I think is really important too in talking about this. And this was the first time that I'd actually seen this practice in person. And so it gave the students an opportunity to see kind of who was at the front of the room and who was at the back based on the questions that were asked, which was extremely eye-opening. And then they brought the results of that back into the classroom. We talked about it. So there are different ways to, I think, expose students to some of these discussions about race and inequality and structural racism. I would say also, I think that, you know, sometimes some of the assignments that I give to students are extra credit assignments that require them to go outside the classroom, right? So not just content in the classroom and the material that we're covering, but also asking or requiring them to attend certain events or to participate in something that's going on either on campus or off campus that relates to some of the themes that we've been discussing over the course of the semester. So last semester, in the spring that just ended, myself and also the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies, we had organized the 1619 project and at Rowan. And so this was going along the lines of the 1619 project that was established by the New York Times. And we had these food and conversations events focused on healthcare disparities, focused on racial inequality, right? Focused on key areas that, economic inequality, key areas that were discussed in the 1619 project article. And students had the opportunity to attend some of these events, and students from my class went, and it was great because they were able to engage in these really, really meaningful discussions. We kind of played part of Nicole Hannah-Jones' podcast, and then we had group discussions about some of the points that were made. And so I think that it's really important for students also, and for faculty to think of creative and meaningful ways for students to learn inside the classroom, but also for them to learn outside the classroom. And I could, you know, there are other ways that you can do this, but yes, I think content is important, but there are a variety of other learning pedagogical approaches that we can use to help students unpack and learn some of these different ways in which we talk about race and racism.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. Do any one of our other panelists have anything to add to that question? But as a reminder, if you can just keep your response to 2 minutes or less.
Yeah, I hate to give a negative without offering a solution, but I was a teacher for 2 years, and my experience is like education programs will try to make diversity a class rather than ingrain that in their school. Like 45 minutes a day, you get to be diverse, and the rest of the day you're doing math, science, reading. And I think that's terrible because it doesn't put the accountability on the teachers and the school as a whole to make the atmosphere receptive. It clearly sends the message that, you know, you only really get to be yourself for 45 minutes with this one teacher, while the rest of the white teachers don't know what to talk about. And so I would just kind of air some caution on that because it doesn't go well. It doesn't have the effective change that you want in school. And if anything, it builds more resentment towards you. Like you're a white teacher and you don't care about these things because you never talk about it. So that's kind of just what I had to say.
Those who are going to be in front of the classroom, we give them the tools that they need. Because now, let's be honest, most of the people in front of the classroom are not going to be a person of color, African American or Hispanic, or another racial minority. So giving them the tools that they need so they can bring up these topics with confidence and not feeling like they're saying ignorant or incorrect things. So that was in harmony with one of our comments. We're going to move on to another question, which I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little biased about from being a chemist myself, but we have a comment from one of our audience members that says, how should we introduce and support anti-racist practices and the support of anti-racist philosophy in STEM classes, which students are typically expecting to be just about learning objective skills and information? So how do we bring this type of pedagogy into STEM classes? So I know you had a comment last question that you didn't get to respond to. Do you want to respond to this question?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you. So I think it kind of wraps in actually into the prior question too, but I just will start by mentioning that I actually was trained and I've taught for 5 years as a middle school life science and math teacher. So so in terms of kind of thinking about how to be able to teach anti-racist pedagogies across the curriculum, I think that that's something important. And that's something that, like people have mentioned prior, is difficult to do and is challenging, but is something that is definitely possible to do and worthwhile to continue to struggle for. I'll just mention a couple things that during the 1950s, 40s and 50s, that when we talk about the idea of race being, like race being biological versus a social construct, that's something you could easily teach in a biology class. It doesn't have to be limited to the social science and humanities. So kind of challenging the idea of the biological nature of race and the kind of essentialism of race, I think is something that has a history, that we have histories, we have models by which people have been able to do this across different curriculums. And I think that we oftentimes forget. I think that's what I really appreciate Dr. Rose's kind of comments historically in terms of recognizing that there's a long history of both oppression, but also resistance, and the work of educators to be able to do that kind of, that work across different curriculums. So for another example, I was teaching over in Oakland Unified over in California, and that's where San Francisco Bay Area is where I'm from. And this is one of the things that we actually, there was a grassroots effort that several of us really kind of spearheaded in Oakland Unified when I was a teacher. We kind of rewrote the secondary school science and STEM curriculum to really kind of think about what it meant to be culturally relevant, culturally responsive, culturally sustaining at that point in time. And again, this is a number of years ago. I'm going to date myself a little bit, but it's one of those, but thinking about what does it mean to be able to draw across that. So it isn't just value added or something to add, but something that looks at it pedagogically in terms of how you actually teach the class, how the classroom interactions work, how the structuring of the class actually works, beyond just the teacher in the classroom, but how the structure of the classes themselves work, who's in the classroom, how the content is, how they're assessed, who the teachers are, but also in terms of the content themselves too. So think about what it means to have environmental racism, what it means to look at pollution in the groundwater, what it means to live near factories, what does it mean to, like, what is the, how do we talk about health disparities? How do we understand what we're talking about in terms of genetic, whatever information? So think about how we kind of attend to those type of conversations in a way that's embedded in the curriculum. And also beyond that, though, embedded in the way that we teach itself. So pedagogy being not simply curriculum, but also kind of the means of teaching. So thinking about how to decenter this kind of neoliberal idea of individual students assessing students. And I really appreciate Dr. Rose's kind of example of collaborative work, student-centered work. So thinking about how to be able to use those with an intention of being anti-racist. And I think that's also really important to kind of reiterate, is that it isn't just simply good teaching practices, but it has to be intentional in terms of thinking about what does it mean to try to be an anti-racist educator. And I think that that's something that needs to be at the forefront of the work that we do, because otherwise it's so easy to get co-opted in terms of the idea of multicultural education, culturally relevant pedagogy. They had radical intentions. They were part of the Black liberation movement at one point, particularly multicultural education, but it's been co-opted in a particular way. And I think that anti-racist teaching, in the same way, we have to be careful in terms of how we talk about it and be clear in terms of our commitments. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Song. And that actually kind of covers an additional question we had from our audience that mentioned how you said you were addressing this at the K through 12 level in the middle school. And that was another one of our audience members had a question about that, and which you addressed, that you have to tackle this topic before they turn 18, before they get to a college campus. And so by giving those tools and tips on doing that, like you said, at the middle school level, as our audience member brings out, when it's really emerging, when those thoughts are really emerging, is also very effective. So thank you for that. So we have another.
Go ahead,
Josh. Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I wanted to add on to the prior to 18. One thing I look back at is no one really educated me. Like, they would teach me a lot about African American history in Salem County, but no one ever came out and said, This is a county that was completely run by the Ku Klux Klan. That's why you've been raised in an environment that was built on racial violence. And that made it so much more confusing to me. And once I realized that, I was like, oh, that's why, no Black people live on my street. That's why, this group of people I grew up with feel this way, is because we're only really 30 years out from that. These people are still here. And I think that's probably really sensitive for an educator to bring up, is the local history. But you have to imagine, I spent every day with my grandfather's generation, and we were all raised there. So you do the math, and I wish I had been more aware of that earlier, as to how that impacted my neighbors, how it segregated the town. And I don't think many people really talk about white violence in their classrooms as it impacted local people, because I think that would have been impactful on me.
Thank you, Josh. And I agree that addressing this from a young age, because young people are the most influenced, right? They're really opening their eyes and allowing them to see that this is an issue that affects them even before, as our audience member mentioned, before they reach the age of 18. There's also another question from our audience. And the question is, or the comment is, when for Dr. Rose, that they are fascinated about your pedagogy, and they notice that when they teach on the topic of race, that their white students will shut down because they think that they're biased. So this question is for you, Dr. Rose, that how do you teach on the topic of race without appearing biased? And remember to try to keep your comments to 2 minutes or less.
I know, historians are so long-winded, sorry. Okay, so I'll try to be quick. Yeah, this is a challenge. I think what I try to do I'll just give this one example, from the very beginning of the semester, the very first week, and I do this in all of my classes. I will assign a reading that requires students to think about, Black, white students with different backgrounds, to think about the content that we're going to be reading, why this course is important, the uncomfortable conversations that we will be having, right? So I've assigned works by Allison Dorsey on teaching African American history and what it's like to have, students with different backgrounds in the classroom, what it means for African American students and other students of color, what it means for white students. So from the very first week, we go deep into discussions about race, about them actually, the makeup of the classroom, about what they feel about being in the classroom. And I try to establish a culture from week one or day one where number one, they know that we're going to have uncomfortable conversations. At the same time, that this is I know it's kind of become a word that's overused at this point, but a safe space for students to have those conversations. I make it very clear that there are very few places, most likely outside of college or their classroom, where they're going to delve in deep and have these kinds of uncomfortable conversations. And so this is a space to do it where I'm not going to allow anyone to be disrespected, but I am going to allow students to engage in conversations and talking about their own experiences in a way that may be uncomfortable. And I know we have, I think, some student panelists from my class who can maybe talk about whether or not I did that effectively or not. So that's first and foremost, trying to really establish ground rules, for lack of a better word, and have them delve into reading from the very first week that address this very issue, kind of getting the elephant out the room, right? Or addressing the elephant in the room, so that this is something that they're aware of. And I've noticed, students will, they feel, I think, more comfortable to talk about this, at least because I've kind of put that out there. At the same time, I also try to find ways for students to work together, and I'm very intentional about this, where they may be talking about or focusing on a particular project, and it's forcing African-American students, students of color, and white students to engage in conversations separately, and then we kind of collectively come back together. So I try to, set it up so that they know that this is what's going to be expected and it's uncomfortable, but I also try to provide space and a setting for them to to engage in those conversations in with a smaller number of students and talk in ways that maybe they wouldn't outside of the classroom. And then final point, names I think are really important. I know as professors we do this. I really try to make sure that I learn the students' names, and so that when they are talking to each other, they refer to the other students' names to try and establish more of a trust and building a kind of relationship in the classroom, even though it's for a short period of time. So the 3 things that I hope are helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. That's something that I actually try to incorporate into my courses as well. Even though I have, over 100 students, I still try to learn everyone's name. And so I think that some of the tools that you brought out also address some of the other questions we had about transforming our curriculum and addressing these topics without trying to, or without being labeled as political or forcing opinions on students, especially again when they're in these types of STEM courses. Also, another one of our audience members brought out that for STEM courses, how we can incorporate minorities into biology or chemistry or any type of science courses by highlighting persons of color who have made impacts into that field of study. So I thank you for your comments, Dr. Rose. And so I'm going to continue with our questions from our audience members. And the next one I have is, how do you have a conversation with colleagues, including those who may be in a position of departmental power, about the need for intentional race discussion when they have said that they don't see race? So any of our panelists have an answer for this comment? So anyone of our panelists want to address that? Grace, you unmuted yourself.
I don't know why I jumped on this one. I am terrible at this particular situation, but I will say that what I have found to be most helpful is to have a very trusted, reliable group of people, colleagues to strategize with about how to hold this conversation with the people. Also reaching out to figure out what the campus resources are to help support the conversation and making those connections. So for instance, the DEI division's certificate in diversity, equity, and inclusion would be an excellent opportunity for that particular faculty member or department leader to come to learn some of the foundational concepts, like that not seeing color is not a progressive good thing, and that there's more to learn, and that's why the conversations have to continue.
Thank you, Dr. Shapiro. Dr. Sung, I think I'm going to direct this next question to you. Can we talk more about different types of intentional pedagogy where the subject doesn't relate to race or the application, more of a focus on how we should be teaching?
Thank you. And I think that that's important, is that we like thinking about that this isn't just content, is also, and it goes beyond that, is how we teach, how we engage with students. So I think that beyond, like you said, beyond the kind of content itself, I think that with the examples that Dr. Rose gave, the examples that have been given by other people, think about how we kind of, how do we put this? Trying to figure out how to put this, but essentially how we really kind of humanize our curriculum, and particularly humanize our curriculum for people who have been dehumanized, people who have been seen as other, people who have been seen in a white supremacist society, people who have been seen as non-white. And that isn't to say that there isn't differences and there isn't ways that we kind of engage in the intersectionality around other positions, patriarchy, class divisions, things like that. But at the same time, think about how to be able to humanize the experience. So everything from using people's, so the simple things from using people's names, being able to collaborate so that people feel like they could meaningfully engage. And I say this even though my starting point was that racism is a structural system, but it also has interpersonal elements, it has cultural elements, it has these different parts that are ingrained in the way that racism functions. So being able to attend all those different points, I think, is really, really important. And in a classroom, there are different, like it's a war position, there's different ways that we kind of engage. So using people's names, collaborative group work, collaborative assignments, forcing students to be able to again, beyond the content itself. And I think that's something important, beyond the content itself, be able to kind of recenter on students who traditionally have been decentered in the way that we question, in the way that we do the Q&As, in the way that we do the kind of classroom discussions, the way that we do the assignments, pushing students to even use office hours. I know that there's cultural capital in terms of certain students being comfortable using office hours and other students not even understanding what office hours are supposed to be about. So I think that all those different aspects or ways that we could, but again, it's the intentionality isn't, and I think that it ties into good teaching, but it isn't simply that. It's intentional about how we do that in a way that is being anti-racist, recognizing the system of racism and trying to actively disrupt and resist it. And that doesn't mean that we can't do stuff in the content too, in the curriculum itself, in the way that we teach, in the way that we include, in the way that we recenter. But I think that pedagogy, again, goes within that, but also beyond that. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sun, for your comments. And those tools that you just iterated also answer another one of our questions from our audience, which is that what specifically at Rowan, and I can attest to this, I've seen it even in my classes, that if you do try to put students into groups, they're going to segregate themselves, where you'll have the white students and the Black students and the Hispanic students will all kind of segregate themselves. And so, like you said, from our own classrooms from the beginning, making sure that we're putting down a framework to show that we as professors, maybe I'll randomize you, or we'll force these students to interact with one another, and having these things in our classrooms as a way to start to, as you said, break down this, the races, or be anti-racist in our pedagogy. And so, again, I'm going to just take one more moment to remind our audience, you can continue to submit questions to our Q&A. Also, remember on your social media to add your comments to we're using our hashtag RU, the 2 letters, and then we are not okay. Josh, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I'm not sure where I stand on the forced randomization thing. Like, but I'm perfectly okay with if African Americans feel most comfortable sitting with other African Americans. I'm not one to break that up, because that's a defense mechanism against maybe an unhealthy environment they might have experienced, and a tool they have to know how to navigate that class. And so the better question, I think, I've always asked myself is, why don't the African Americans in your class feel comfortable sitting anywhere? And I think the answer is they don't feel welcome. They don't know if they'll be treated equally. And so I think that brings a much longer task of, like, how do you build express support from the students and yourself in the room, so that no matter what group you put them in, they're not going to feel the need to compartmentalize.
Can I just add to Josh's comment?
Sure, go ahead, Dr. Rose.
Yeah, so I think that's a really important point, and I think it depends on the demographic makeup of the course. So that makes absolute sense, right? If you're teaching a course like many of our courses, I'm sure, where you have majority white and a select few of African Americans. Whereas in my courses, especially my Introduction to Africana Studies courses, and lately my African American History of Civil Rights, it's actually the inverse, right? That I have majority students of color, and I think for many of my white students, it's the first time that they've actually been a minority in the classroom. So the class dynamics are different, and so that requires me to think differently about the way in which I may have the students engage, which in contrast to a class makeup that would be more along the lines of what Josh is talking about. And I will say too that I think that, just as a side note, and white students have told me this, that them for the first time even being a minority in the classroom, that in and of itself was an eye-opening and teaching experience for them, because it's something they're not used to.
Can I jump in real? I know that we have multiple
Go ahead.
questions.
No, go ahead, Dr. Fine. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that not to pile on, and I think that there's a usefulness in both. I don't think there's one right solution, so I want to be really clear on that. I think there's a usefulness in pushing people outside of their comfort zones, and there's also, like Josh and Dr. Rose was mentioning, there's also usefulness in recognizing that people, particularly people who have been oppressed and historically, like this is a mechanism to be able to protect. And I think that being able to think about more deeply, why is it that they feel that they need to be able to self-separate or to be able to protect themselves, I think is an important way to, is an important thing to be able to think about in terms of the teaching itself. So recognize, and I think that also kind of ties into a point that oftentimes is made around, oftentimes anti-racist teaching centers on whiteness in a point where, again, everything centers on whiteness in education, traditional mainstream education, and recognizing that even these race discussions oftentimes center on whiteness, where we're trying to make sure that white students can learn, meet students of color, so I think that recognizing that work towards, I don't want to say the lowest common denominator exactly, but that work also is violent too. That we have to decenter whiteness even in the way that we create our classroom. So it isn't centering on the kind of fragility, the kind of, the fears of white students, and kind of making them kind of get to the point. We need to be able to push further than that, because otherwise oftentimes we never get beyond that first step. And oftentimes it's the students of color who are forced to live through this kind of explaining themselves and explaining their humanity over and over and over again. But thinking about how to be able to do both, pushing everybody outside of the comfort zones and and pushing interactions in the public square, but at the same time recognizing that there are important points and reasons that students do what they do and self-segregate. Yes. The other thing I would just mention that I was thinking was also in terms of assignments themselves, the kind of the question before that was even not just the content, but also the assignments. That one of the assignments that I have is writing that they do a final research project and then they write a letter to the elected representative. Another one that I've done in a prior class is doing a panel presentation that we do to a community nonprofit that we, like that's working community. We take a community issue when I was over in Oakland, and then we do this kind of a community forum. So thinking about, and this could be done in STEM classes, this could be done in all different kinds of classes. So thinking about, and this could be also applied to higher education too. So you could take things in the statistics class and be able to apply it around health disparities and, or issues around wealth disparities or different things, so we could do this in a math class. If it's, we could be able to take on how different chemicals affect different things in different ways. So I think that there's ways that we could do that in the content, in the assignments, in the way that we teach, in the way that we engage with students. So just to kind of mention that too.
Thank you, Dr. Sung. Our next audience question, I'm actually going to direct to Dr. Shapiro. What are some ideas for how student affairs professionals and faculty members can partner to support and promote anti-racist teaching?
Student affairs professionals. So like academic advisors, is that what's included in that?
They weren't specific. They just said student affairs professionals, but yeah.
Okay. So I think one thing that would be really useful for me as a faculty member, I know that advisors get a really special kind of one-on-one experience with students that faculty don't necessarily get. They often meet with students who faculty don't see in a one-on-one context. So you may have a sense of lore around certain classes, certain faculty members. I think if we could have more exchange, if I knew, for instance, that one of my courses was being experienced in a particular way by students of color, I would be able to respond to that immediately, right? Or if I were in a position where I were, directing a program and I was hearing that about some of the courses in my program, I'd be able to intervene. So I think direct communication, if advisors, for instance, are hearing troubling thoughts or troubling experiences from students, would be really helpful. I'm not sure what else would count as part of student affairs in terms of this question. So if you want to clarify, by all means, please do, and I can try to respond to that.
Thank you, Dr. Shapiro. I mean, I think that's a great start. And just continuing our conversation we were having about how we revolutionize our curriculums and how we design our courses. As we know, due to the pandemic, a lot of us had to transition our courses to remote learning. And so we have another question from our audience to say do we have any specific recommendations for how we can plan to continue or to start maybe including this type of pedagogy as we navigate remote learning formats? Any one of our panelists can take this question.
I would just add two things that I found pretty helpful. One is well, it was on Blackboard, so now I know we're transitioning to Canvas, but I'm sure there's a similar function with the interactive student discussions on discussion board that I would have the students, depending on the topic for the week, I would have students either read or watch something. And so it could be a text, or it could be a podcast or a TED Talk or part of a documentary. And then I would give students prompts, right, specific questions, and then they engage. And I actually was concerned at the beginning because I thought that there's no way that this is going to do what or have the same results as what I like to do in the classroom. But it was actually it was just another format to engage in discussion in a different way, but it was still productive. And I noticed how some students, I guess, well, I can't really say anonymity because they know who's responding to certain questions, but they maybe felt actually more comfortable being expressive and articulating their views online as opposed to actually face-to-face in the classroom. So I was able to see how, depending on the topic, many of them dealing with inequity or race or gender or other issues that we were discussing for that week, that format and that form was really, I think, great for students. And then it gave me an opportunity to kind of follow up when we did do remote, when I did remotely engage with the students during a lecture to kind of say, oh, I saw, in the interactive discussion that you were really talking about this, or this theme really was important to you. And so that's one way that I think you can still do some of this kind of work or integrate it into your remote teaching or online teaching. And I would also say, different, I'm a big fan of like really short podcasts or TED Talks or documentaries. I think those are great ways to have kind of students watch them before class, and then when, I guess if you're doing completely online, I'm not sure exactly how you would do that, but for me, they would kind of watch it before class, and then when we come into our face-to-face online discussion, there would be room for us to kind of talk about what they watch. So there are different ways, I think, to integrate some of that remotely that can still be pretty productive.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. Dr. Shapiro, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, so in addition to taking up anti-racist content in the class, how we structure the online learning environment can be approached from an anti-racist perspective, and one that takes the needs of students of color and into the forefront. The Center for Urban Education has a free 6-part webinar series on racial equity and online teaching that I've been slowly making it through in preparation for the fall, and it's fabulous. I very highly recommend it. But also I would recommend 2 basic communication platforms. One is GroupMe and the other is Remind. And why I think this is so important is so many of us saw a lot of attrition in our transition to online classes, and having students install these apps on their phone, one or the other, it goes right to their phone. They can do it through text message. It feels more personal. And also there's, that notification, that ping is coming through the phone, so they're more likely to respond. So I do recommend having a non-email, non-Canvas platform for communicating with your students so that you can be like, hey, I'm concerned about you, what's happening for real. So.
Thank you, Dr. Shapiro. I actually use GroupMe in my classroom, and you'd be surprised how many students appreciate having that extra layer of interaction. And I find it not just interaction with me personally, but interaction with each other. Right? And then it translates to the classroom, right? Because they're interacting with each other on GroupMe, and then they bring those same interactions back into the classroom. So I can attest to the usefulness of that particular app. And so I'm going to just continue the conversation forward a little bit. I'll just remind our panelists our audience to continue uploading your questions into our Q&A box here. And so I'll just go ahead and open up the discussion to ask any of our panelists to answer this question. What conditions need to exist in higher education, or specifically at Rowan, to support anti-racist teaching? So any of you can feel free to answer this question, or maybe Josh, if you want to start, what do you think is important or needs to exist to support anti-racist teaching at Rowan?
I think it's the biggest issue in higher ed is like the bureaucracy of things. Everything exists on this timeline of this has to be approved by this person, and this enigmatic figure said no, and we don't get to know who that person is. They just said no, and so we can't do it now. And there has to be more transparency and just the urgency. When I've worked on these issues, that was always the frustration with me, is people talking to me about timelines and policy when I was trying to explain to them, this is something that could ruin this person's life tomorrow. And so with higher ed, I always get frustrated with the lack of urgency surrounding racial justice, that there's not a timeline. It's a now thing. And so I think maybe with all of this happening, the hope I have that comes out of it, if anything good can come out of it, is that at least I'm seeing urgency from people to that now is the time to do something. We can't wait 6 weeks for a turnaround on an email that's going to be passed to someone else. And the other thing is I think you need to really assess what the needs of students are at Rowan. It is lower income, it is a lot of first gen, and there is a gap with things like food scarcity and housing scarcity on the campus that I feel should be addressed before the continued normal expansion of the university. And I say that I work at Johns Hopkins, and you could make the same criticism about Johns Hopkins and the entire city of Baltimore. So yeah, I think it just needs a little more action for me right now than anything in particular.
I would just add that I'm part of a diversity and inclusion MA committee, and actually I think the MA degree was just successfully passed, and so that's at the graduate level that we're now offering through the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies an MA in diversity and inclusion, and so I think that's definitely geared towards doing some of this anti-racist work. I know also that several years ago I was part of the planning stages of a committee for us to think about offering a diversity requirement for students at Rowan, for undergraduate students. I know that there are several universities that do this. At the time, I think we were in the early stages of thinking about, whether this would be a bank of courses that all students had to take, how that would work with different majors. There was a lot of discussion about it, trying to develop a task force. I don't know, forgive me if it's gone somewhere. I haven't been up on it lately. I know that the Senate Diversity Committee, I believe, was doing some work on it, but I think that's another way to think about how we do some of this work, is that regardless of your major or your degree, every student at Rowan University would be required at some point to take one or some of these courses. And to Josh's point, the goal, I hope, is not just, okay, so you take a course and it's kind of like, that's it and you keep moving and it doesn't really have any impact. I think we wanted to do it in a meaningful way so that, whether you're an engineering major, physics major, communications, whatever, at some point you have been required to take these diversity requirement courses. And I hope we're now at a time where we could potentially carry on or continue rather the conversations about that.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. And any one of our other panelists, Dr. Shapiro, Dr. Sung, did you have anything you wanted to add before we move on from this question?
I'll jump in real quick. So, I mean, I think that there's two main things for me. One is that there's a real commitment by the people in power, and that the commitment is translated into some type of institutionalized, funded, properly funded kind of initiatives that are both accountable and transparent. I think that that kind of the structural, if we're talking about trying to reimagine higher education to be anti-racist, I think like Dr. Rose, like Josh were mentioning, that it has to be beyond just kind of a token course or courses or something, you know, like, but particular course, I think that that oftentimes is what happens. So, so we really need to be able to imagine some type of structural, you know, initiative that is funded, that is committed to, and that is transparent and accountable, because oftentimes it just kind of gets lost in, you know, gets lost in everything else that happens. I think the second thing is also there needs to be a culture change, that we need to be able to bring in a critical mass of faculty who could do this work, because I think that that's something that most institutions oftentimes lack. So recognizing that we need to be able to bring in people to be able to do that, and to be able to imagine how to get students, faculty, administration, how to get them on board with this so that it becomes something that is campus wide. And both of these are difficult, multi-year. I'm not saying it's going to happen in the next month or year, and particularly with the pandemic and everything else that's happening amidst everything. I think that that's, you know, but I think that this is something that if we really want to be able to imagine a new type of university that is anti-racist, that's going to be something that happens. And then the last one is recognizing that there is an attrition towards kind of moving down to the inertia of the kind of grammar, underlying grammar schooling, like what is traditionally valued as core, and then what is seen as kind of like topical or something that's above and beyond. And if we really say that anti-racist teaching and recognizing dismantling white supremacy, patriarchy, all the other things is something that is fundamental and core to our university, then that has to be that. And it cannot be something that we add to, and then all of a sudden when we're losing funding or we have a funding crisis, that's the first thing that gets cut, because that's almost always what happens. So I think those are the three main things that I'd like to bring up too.
And like you said, right, so intentionality, right, Dr. Sung, is huge. Like, it's not just going to I mean, I think this is why the new office or DEI and what you guys are doing is so important. But it, you know, if we're serious about this, right, we want to see this reflected in our faculty. We want to see this reflected in our administration. We want to see, and not just diversity for diversity's sake, but really being intentional about how we do this. I think that's really important, and that has to come from the top.
To add on to that, I think it's important that a lot of this stuff is moving forward behind the scenes. I've been working on, with a number of other people, adding language to our MOA, where we are asking faculty candidates or inviting them to speak to the ways that their pedagogy, their research, and their service are contributing to making our campus more diverse, inclusive, and equitable, so that that experience becomes valued at the institutional level as meaningful and important work. We know that faculty of color take on a huge amount of burden in mentoring students of color, having far more of a load that way, for instance, additional service related to DEI issues. So making sure that that's valued and taken into account is a big part of the structural piece of this. But also with a cultural shift, another thing that we're working towards is having departmental diversity councils. This was a resolution that we passed through the Senate Diversity Committee. And I've started one in my own department, and I'm about to start one at the college level as well as in all of the departments of my college. And mine has over 20 members, and they are adjuncts, they are lecturers, they are full-time people, and they are grad student instructors. And they are really dedicated, hardworking people. And we've seen an incredible amount of small, but very incremental and very culture shifting kinds of change. So drawing on the labor of, you know, shared work and dedicated people to make change throughout your culture and your department at the local level will spread through the university.
Thank you, Dr. Shapiro. So at this time, our panelists have been receiving personalized questions, some of them that they've been able to respond to. But if any one of our panelists has received a question to their personal Q&A that they would like to address now at this point, this is the time that we're going to do that. So does any one of our panelists want to begin with a question that they want to address from their personal Q&A?
Oh, well, unfortunately, I can't see that because I'm on the phone, so I'm going to have to.
I'm sorry, Dr. Rose.
Okay.
I'll just go in order. So I'll start with Josh. Did you have a question in your panel, in your Q&A panel that you want to answer? I saw you responding to some. You have to unmute yourself.
I think I've responded to most of them, but briefly, just because it was hard to go back and forth. Yeah, so thoughts on how to educate our white students on racial literacy without catering to or centering them. For me, service was the best way. And I'm really big on being like a silent advocate. Like if, for example, my church is getting involved in human trafficking in Baltimore. If I've never been around that before, and so when I show up, I'm going to show up and be quiet and try to be useful. And I think that'll give me better empathy skills with that population. It's very difficult within the context of a classroom. And I'm always on the fence about this, but it's like with domestic violence, for example, you have the battered and the batterer, and they both need therapy and education, but not in the same place and not in the same way. And so it's almost like if you're being intentional about it, you almost have to make a safe space for the white students if you want to go all the way there and just talk to them straight up and outright about like, look, this is what's happening and this is what it is. And that may not be applicable, but it's very difficult to talk about white supremacy in the way it impacts them without centering whiteness, because that's what you're talking about. You're talking about the fact that they're white people on a college campus. And so, yeah, those are the two options I would say.
Thank you, Josh. I'm just going to address a few questions that we have from our audience about URM faculty and where they can find support or mentorship within the Department of College. At the university level, I'm actually chair of the Community for Underrepresented Faculty and Staff. And that is what the aim of our group is to be a safe space, to be a place where persons of color, Black, Hispanic, and other people of color can find a place where they can get advice, mentoring, support. And so I would ask any who are interested to please, you can send me an email after our discussion at barrettk@rowan.edu. And I'll be happy, I work with DEI, and I'd be happy to incorporate you into our affinity group. So continuing with our panelists' individual Q&A sessions, let's go to you, Dr. Sung. Did you have any questions in your personal Q&A that you would like to answer?
Actually, I had a question that came up right before this session about the session. So I figured that actually would be an interesting one for me to kind of answer. So, and I think this is about the idea of the politics of education and how to be able to teach whether, like can we put politics into our education? Can we take it out? How do we just teach? And I think that's an important point that I'd like to kind of draw upon is that everything is political. Educating is political. It's a political act. I just want to be clear about that. It's a political act where we either resist or continue to reproduce, contestations of power. So, but I think that the idea of being political is something that's used oftentimes as almost a pejorative type of term, where it becomes like something that is seen by the mainstream as something that's controversial, and therefore their worry is, should I be able to put this into the classroom? What happens if I do? What happens? So, and I think that that's something to be clear about in terms of what we're talking about. And I'd like to kind of point out that, like a better way to respond to this for me would be what are considered the importance of bringing up controversial topics in the classroom as a way to be able to educate all students, because the world changes. It changes so rapidly that we can't imagine, in some ways, we can. There's a continued significance of particular histories and oppressions. So patriarchy, white supremacy, class, capitalism. But at the same time, there's also ways that these things will change, and we need to be able to educate our future generation of leaders, educators, everybody else, citizens, to be able to kind of engage with these kind of conversations that will change and And by doing that, the best way to do that, I would argue, is by being able to bring up controversial topics where there may not be one easy or right answer to, or that there, and I think that that's something that's important to be able to embed into the curriculum. And that's something that if we want to do anti-racist teaching, if we want to do teaching that really pushes, we have to be able to be comfortable with that. I know that's difficult to do, and I know a lot of people don't feel comfortable doing that, but I think that's something that we need to kind of push as instructors, as an institution, to be able to think about. So it isn't just whether something's political or not. I think that that actually changes. So even the idea of Black Lives Matter, that slogan is something that 3 years ago, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago could have been something that people in a lot of educational settings would have been like, is that too controversial comment to be able to bring up? And in a way that 3 weeks later, the whole mainstream discourse of things on down, and obviously we have, but I think that that's something that has changed so much. There's a groundswell of change, and to not be able to have brought that up with our students before, to not be able to bring it up with our students now, it's not to be able to recognize that we have to. That's the work of education, is consciousness building and recognizing that there are going to be changes, and we should be part of that change. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sung. Yes, I definitely agree that change is dynamic and continuously evolving. Dr. Shapiro, did you have a question from your personal Q&A that you wanted to answer?
I do. Amanda Rennie, thank you. She said, I'd love to hear you talk about how anti-racist assessment in writing happens, especially since most departments require writing from their students at some point. So what I tell my pre-service teachers and my grad students who are teaching writing is that grades try to standardize something that is not a standard thing. Learning isn't standard. Our courses are not standard. Our students are not standard. So what grades communicate is very little and not very meaningful. Assessment should be about teaching, and we should engage in principles of instructional alignment. So what that means is if you're not teaching it, you shouldn't be grading it, right? So if you're not teaching grammar and standard English, or the format of the thing that you're asking your students to write, then you shouldn't be taking points off based on that. So the grades that we assign should match our course outcomes. They should match the things we're actually teaching our students. Because if we're not doing that, then we're grading our students based on the knowledge they're already coming in with, rather than what we've prepared them to give back to us. So one way to get around that is through a practice called labor-based grading contracts, and it grades on the work that students complete rather than the quality of that work. And I'd love to talk to people, in another venue about what that looks like and how that works, but I've found it to be hugely successful. And it changes the nature of assessment because I'm able to teach rather than give people reasons why they got a particular grade. They choose the grade, I do the teaching.
Thank you, Dr. Shapiro. That is a very interesting concept, and I'd love to have a conversation with you about that. With that, we'd like to thank all of our panelists for this great discussion today. I want to remind everyone who's in attendance in our audience today that we have another session, a part of this series, White People Do Something, a dialogue on whiteness and allyship. That's going to be held on Friday, June 12th at 3 p.m. You can see the flyer here on your screen. If any of our audience wants more information regarding the rest of our series or resources, I know that there were some comments in our Q&A boxes about resources. You can visit the Division of Equity and Inclusion's website at rowan.edu/DEI. So with that, I'd like to once again say thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to our provost, Dr. Lohman, our board members, our president for allowing us to have this series. And this will conclude today's session. And everyone have a great night. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.